First of all, it was initiated by God. I will be your God. And then you will be my people. It works both ways. I've said many times that when I celebrate a wedding, one of the things that I like to talk about with a couple is the nature of the covenant into which they are entering. Because it is a sacred agreement that they make with each other. It's not a casual, I'll live with you if you live with me. But when you actually take vows to each other, it becomes a sacred moment. Because in that covenant, you are promising something that has meaning, that goes beyond the momentary circumstance you may be dealing with at any given moment. It's supposed to be written on your heart in such a way that whenever you are in any situation, the first thing you remember is this covenant that you have entered into. God was asking those who first became aware that he said, I will be your God and you will be my people, that he was inviting us into a sacred agreement. That he would, or God would, we're so used to using the word he, but that God would somehow abide with us through thick and thin. That it wouldn't be just an arrangement where, oh God, we'll just observe whatever you want us to observe as long as we're happy and well taken care of. But even in the most difficult moments of life, God's intent was that we should not forget the sacredness of this covenant that God made with us. I will be your God, and you will be my people. How else could Paul celebrate when he wrote these letters to these early churches to encourage them to remain strong in the faith if he had not understood the sacred nature of this covenant? It was written deep within the marrow of his bones. The transformation that had taken place in his life was so powerful that every time he wrote a letter to a group of Christians anywhere around Asia Minor, it came out in everything he said. It was a covenant. That is, he understood what it meant to be in a sacred agreement with God. One of the things that I believe we have lost over the years is our understanding of this covenant relationship. We want to believe in God when it's nice and easy for us, but when it's difficult for us, we sometimes forget that it is a sacred agreement. The unfolding drama of this book actually reveals to us how the people God made this covenant with went from, isn't it great to be in a relationship with a God who brings us out of bondage to slavery and into a promised land, to what we read in Samuel. We want a king. We don't want God anymore. We want an actual living, breathing presence to lord it over us. Samuel, being wise enough to understand, and also understanding the nature of this covenant, tried to dissuade these people. But they would have none of it. And the unfolding drama of Scripture reveals to us what really took place generation after generation. God trying to reestablish, even in the most difficult moments of these people, what it meant to be in this sacred relationship. Even when they had wandered far away from the very things in which he was trying to encourage them in their way of life, he never gave up on that covenant relationship. As much as we sometimes waffle and waver about all of this, God remains the constant. For example, how many times did God's people, while they were under one king or another, even with David at his best, but so many other kings who did exactly what Samuel had proclaimed, taking advantage of all of the resources and surrounding himself with luxury, pomp, and circumstance, while the people out there were suffering and in need. It didn't matter. I think about that today, my friends, when we live in a world where we just had a terrible hurricane in a place like Puerto Rico. You're telling me we don't have the resources as a people to respond to the needs of folks who are in that kind of situation? We are so well off that it's unbelievable. And yet there are people there who are still struggling to even get back to what we would call normal. And there are still people dying because the resources that should be available to them are no longer available. Compound that by all of the other places in the world where we see human need and where we see world leaders who have forgotten that the reason they are leaders is to reach out and make life better for their people, for the world around them. They are so much a representation of what Samuel described God telling people it would be like. We live in a world where we have the capacity to truly meet the needs of not only people, but the very creation itself. And yet we seem to be dismantling rather than promoting and encouraging and building up. So when Paul wrote this letter to 2 Corinthians, to the church at Corinth, he used it as a way to remind them that we have a sacred arrangement. And as a people of faith, we have a sacred arrangement with God. I will be your God. You will be my people. You know, it's kind of a strange misnomer that we call ourselves a Christian nation. Think about that for a moment. First of all, we're probably one of the most diverse nations on the face of the earth when it comes to religious tradition and belief. But the real meaning of a Christian nation is that we are in this covenant relationship. We claim that as a covenant, and yet do we exist to live it out? Now the question, of course, is not a matter of nations, it's also a matter of persons. Because God meant that to be not just a national statement for the people he brought out of slavery in Egypt, but God meant that to be for me and you as well. Your roots and my roots go back to that very statement. I will be your God. You will be my people. And what does that mean? Well, I thought of some words that I might use this morning that would remind us of what a covenant relationship was all about. The first part of the covenant is that God promises deliverance. That no matter what we may be facing in our lives each and every day, God is at work for our good. Even in the most difficult of circumstances, whatever they are, God is eager to find a way to bring us through to a better place, to a better understanding, to a sense that we have been through and we are now set on a right and new path. The second thing God promised in this covenant relationship is to be faithful, not to waver. That no matter what, God is God. And God is always going to be present to us and at work in us and through us. Faithfulness. Why would God bring a people out of the bondage to slavery and sin to just simply abandon them in the midst of a troubled world? God is faithful to us. And that sacred covenant is a reminder of the faithfulness of God. No matter what, God is faithful. And the third thing that I would like to say this morning, that God is eager to bless us. Think about that. Sometimes we take the circumstances of life for granted until they disappear. And even in the midst of that, God is seeking to find a way to bring a blessing, to somehow bring renewal, new hope, new purpose, a new opportunity into our lives that becomes a blessing for us. I think many times of the poem that people like to quote when they're going through a tough time, Footprints, remember that one? And they say, I was walking on the beach, I only saw one set of footprints. Where were you? And then the truth suddenly dawns. Those were my footprints. I was carrying you. Blessed. You see, when we think about our relationship coming from way back hundreds and thousands of years ago to this very moment, it's a sacred arrangement God has made with us. But there are some expectations. And this is where it always gets more difficult for the human family. Because one of the expectations is that we will trust and believe what God began, God will complete. That's a very central part of why these people were brought out of bondage. It's a very central part of why we're here in terms of our own spiritual journeys. To believe that God is God and that God is at work in the world. Trust God. We have a tendency to trust everything around us when basically we end up being disappointed by most of it in one way or another. Trusting in God. Obedience. You know, Samuel had such a terrible time, and the people of Israel had such a terrible time being obedient. They went from pillar to post trying to find a way to disagree with God and God's ways. Right from the very beginning, if you go back and look at, after the covenant was made, they're wandering in the wilderness toward the promised land. They're complaining about food. They're complaining about water. They're complaining about security. They're complaining about anything they can complain about. They complain about it. And yet they forget what life was like when they were in Egypt. Friends, sometimes we need to remember by looking back and seeing how it was and remembering now how it is. And even though wandering in the wilderness is sometimes a very difficult experience, there is the promise that you will make it through to the promised land. God's not going to abandon you in the middle. So be obedient. Get on the journey. Keep walking in the direction God is leading you, because there you will find the fulfillment that God has promised to us. It's when we divert ourselves and go off on all of these tangents that somehow we diminish what God is really trying to accomplish for us and in us and through us. So trust and obedience. And the third thing is loyalty. You know, there are so many loyalties laying claim upon our time, our energy, our resources. You know, it's a sad thing when Jesus was in the midst of dealing with a large crowd of people. Not only were his enemies saying that what he was doing was Satan's work, but even his family came and said, "Oh, something wrong with this guy. We need to take care of him." And then he said, "Who is my family? Who is my mother? Who is my brother?" Friends, everything in our lives will find its proper place when we express and live out loyalty to the way that God has for us. He doesn't mean that you have to deny your family. He doesn't mean that you don't have a mother or a brother or precious people in your lives, but they take on their precious nature because you understand what a sacred covenant really is all about. And so these things are things that Samuel was trying to convey to the people of the Old Testament. These were the things that Paul was celebrating as he wrote his letters to the various churches. These were the very things that Jesus was trying to get people to understand as he ministered to their needs in every circumstance about which we read in the New Testament. Let's go back and take a look. How did we get here? I will be your God. You will be my people. Let's live that covenant relationship out in our relationships with one another, in the community, in the world of which we are a part. I will be your God.